Hi, good evening. My name is Dan Spencer. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program at the University of Montana, and I want to welcome you to this evening's alumni panel looking at public interest environmental science. I'm going to pause the recording for a moment here until we have everybody ready to go, and then I'll recommence. Start the recording here, and I want to just say welcome to everybody. My name is Dan Spencer, and I'm currently the director of the Environmental Studies program here, although I'm in the presence of several living legends from the Environmental Studies program. That is quite an honor, quite delightful. This is a second in a series of alumni panels featuring some of our environmental studies alums from recent years here. Its origins were originally in what was planned to be a 50th reunion celebration in May. And we had a whole series of alumni panels planned for that to gather to celebrate 50 years of the Environmental Studies program, but COVID intervened and made it not possible for us to gather physically, but we were able to gather in these contexts here. And so in October, we hosted a panel with Tracy Stone Manning, Brian Farashi O'Malley, and Anna Peterson to look at shaping government and influencing policy, and had a really wonderful evening with that here. We thought it would be particularly appropriate now to do a panel on looking at public interest environmental science, particularly in the wake of the elections. The science has been such an issue in policy dimensions in this current administration. Many of us are hopeful it will have a different impact in coming administration, maybe taken seriously again. But there's a wide range of issues now where public interest environmental science. And of course, that really is in some ways the origins of the Environmental Studies program, was the environmental science issues that faced the Missoula Valley, Montana, and the nation back around the first Earth Day in 1970, and that period here. And so we've come full circle in many different ways here. I want to acknowledge a couple other people. Brian E. Schwann has been the primary organizer of the panel this evening, and thank you, Brian E., so much for your continued really good work with that. And I'm joined by my colleague and the longest serving faculty member of the Environmental Studies program, now with emeritus status, but Vicki Watson, who spans both millennia of the program here, and is going to co-facilitate with me tonight. And I've asked Vicki if she would go ahead and introduce our panelists, because she knows all three of you in different capacities. And then we have a few questions that we'll pose to folks to get the conversation started, but we want really encourage people to join in as you're able. So Vicki, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I was going to make the same point that environmental studies was started and has been maintained by public interest environmental scientists. And when I put together this particular panel, I had a person from each of the 5 decades of the program. But when we switched to this, we took a subset of them, but they are all outstanding. People who have made an outstanding difference for the environment, and I'll just say a little bit about each of them. First, Chris Brick was 16 years as the science director for the Clark Fork Coalition. She just recently retired, and that is a river conservation group here in western Montana focused on the Clark Fork watershed. Her EVST master's thesis focused on how manipulating lake levels in Flathead Lake affected the flow of groundwater through salmon spawning beds. And she worked on that with Bill Wutzner of geology. Then after EVST MS, she got a PhD in geosciences here at UM, working with Johnny Moore, which she focused on the chemistry and hydrology of the Clark Fork River. She's worn many hats, always a public interest environmental scientist, whether she was doing mining geology or groundwater consulting or working in science education. She's done all those things. And she continues to volunteer on various conservation groups' boards. In 2013, I was very happy when the Missoula Conservation Roundtable awarded her the Arnold Bowley Conservation Professional Award. Once again, an award that's essentially thanking her for her work in public interest environmental science. I'm sure she will talk about how her work on restoration plans for the Clark Fork River when we ask her the question about what was the most critical thing that she's worked on. At least that's my guess. Then next we have Joel Tickner. And he is a professor of public health at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, where I'm going to run out of time here to go through all of these, where he directs the Chemicals Policy and Science Initiative of the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, also the Undergrad Environmental Health Program, also the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. I could go on and on. I don't know when he ever has time to sleep. He's served as an advisor and researcher for both US and international agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and trade unions. He also served on EPA's National Pollution Prevention and Toxics Advisory Committee and the National Academy of Sciences panels on alternative assessments and safer chemistry. Looking way back to his EVST MS, he focused on how using the precautionary principle to regulate industry could help Hungary clean up and protect its environment. He worked on that with Bruce Jennings and Mary O'Brien of EVST and Dick Barrett of economics. In addition to his MS in EVST, he also has a PhD in, I've never heard of this particular topic area, but it sounds like a wonderful one, a PhD in work environment, cleaner production, and pollution from the University of Massachusetts. And last, there's Alex Scanton. She's the Director of Science and Research at Women's Voices for the Earth. She authors their scientific reports on toxic chemicals found in products that we all use and the impact of those chemicals on health. She works to establish and maintain the scientific credibility of that organization's programs. Before she was with WEAVE, she worked in epidemiology and statistics for the American Lung Association. She currently sits on the Research Advisory Committee for the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative and on the Institutional Biosafety Committee for Rocky Mountain Labs. Her major professor was Tom Roy, and her grad paper focused on how to get folks living in apartment complexes to reduce waste and increase recycling. She now lives and works in Woodland Park, Colorado with her husband and two very talented contra dancing daughters.
Vicki, thank you so much, and welcome again to everybody here. I'm going to get us started here, and we actually have several current environmental studies students or listening in on the panel tonight, which I'm delighted about here. And so this first question, just to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your career after graduating from EVST. How did you get from EVST to where you are now? And I think I'll start with Joel to start us off on this one here.
Wow. So, well, you know, it was actually the connections. I'll take a step back before EVST, right? Someone was asking me, how did I end up in Montana? And it was because Duke wouldn't give me enough money for grad school and Montana was cheaper. But serendipitously and luckily, I ended up in Montana the same semester that both Bruce Jennings and Mary O'Brien arrived. And because of their interest in toxics, particularly pesticides, both being on the board of the Pesticide Action Network, both coming from advocacy, policy, toxics backgrounds, that's where I ended up, was working on those issues. And so during my master's thesis, through Mary and Bruce, I met pretty much many of the people who are now my colleagues and friends in the toxics movement, including my PhD mentor, Ken Geiser. So I finished my master's. I actually had going for a PhD as a backup because Ken Geiser was sort of the father of toxics reduction and safer chemicals, was at UMass Lowell, which had a similar program. The UMass Lowell Work Environment Program was a bunch of activists from Harvard who thought Harvard was too conservative and left Harvard to form their own sort of visionary program. The vice chancellor at Lowell was a socialist political economist who thought that UMass Lowell, this public school, should be the Harvard for the working class, and basically recruited all these amazing faculty to form this occupational environmental health program that was focused on, you know, improving people's lives. So I ended up at Lowell, but at the same time got a job with the public interest research groups with one of their offshoots called the National Environmental Law Center. So I worked there for 2 years while starting my PhD work, and then just went into, started working more with community groups in Louisiana and California and started my PhD work. And Ken was actually on the board of Greenpeace. And one day as I'm in the middle of my PhD work says, I don't want to tell you this, but Greenpeace needs a scientist. So I started working part-time or half-time with Greenpeace on the toxics campaign as a scientist on in various efforts while I was doing my PhD. But I think in the end, you know, I went to get a PhD partly because I started into advocacy and realized that having those letters after my name would give me an amount of credibility in the public sphere and the political sphere that they're totally meaningless. And I know people who have 8th grade educations who are smarter than me, but they gave me some legitimacy. So I continued along that path and realized that being in academia gave me a base to do activism, and being at a state university where, you know, my job is to serve the public interest. I'm a state employee, so my job is to make, you know, the Commonwealth and the world better. So so I stayed in academia to use another part of it is I hate hierarchy. So I was in a program that didn't have a lot of hierarchy in a university where I could go right to the chancellor, and just that was a good place for me to be and stay and continue to do my work. So I've been there and haven't left. You're on mute, Dan. You're on mute.
Yeah,
There.
I'm just curious, Joel, did you come originally from the East Coast out to Montana and then move back to the East Coast?
No, I did my undergraduate work at Colby in Maine, and then went to live in Spain for 3 years. I actually was pre-med as an undergrad, which is why in my PhD I went back into the sciences. My EVST degree was more social sciences, law, some science, but I realized I needed to go back to the sciences and be strong in the science, the policy. So I'm a generalist. I'm not, you know, people ask me, what are you? I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a toxicologist. I sort of call myself an environmental health professional, but you know, but then I'm seen as this expert in green chemistry. So I'm not a chemist, but you know, people call me a green chemist, so I will just wear that title too.
Well, I think you do the profile of environmental studies extremely well, because one of the things we pride ourselves in is producing skilled generalists who can work in many different branches on that. But Chris, do you want to follow up on that and tell us a little bit about your pathway? I think you're still muted. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, after EVST, I mean, I knew that I wanted to continue my education. I wanted to continue to learn things sort of beyond what I had gotten out of my master's degree. And I really appreciated EVST because it gave me a chance to not only continue to be a scientist, but also to look at science more holistically and to connect science with what I think of as the real world sometimes, particularly with society. So, but I did want to go back for more science. And so, but nonetheless, I had to work for a while. And so I worked as a groundwater consultant and got a lot of good experience doing that for a couple of years. And then I did come back to UM to study. It was sort of a combination of groundwater, surface water interaction and the cycling of heavy metals in the Clark Fork. Is I'm sure many, if not all of you know that the Clark Fork has been contaminated from over 100 years of mining in the headwaters. And so anyway, that's what I worked on for my PhD. And then after that, I had been teaching some, and I became interested in how people learn. And it was really obvious that you can't simply, kind of deliver science like you would deliver a pizza. You have to help people understand. You have to help figure out how to dispel sort of preconceived notions that people already have, and how you can then move on from that point and actually teach science. And so I was interested in questions like that. I applied for a postdoc from the National Science Foundation, which I got for 3 years. And I was working with the GLOBE program, which at that time was a NASA program. NASA at that time had a mission to planet Earth, which I don't believe exists anymore. That was during the basically climate science cuts. And that was for, the GLOBE program was great. It was a program where students, K-12 students, would collect all kinds of sort of earth science data and atmospheric data. And then my job was to help teachers figure out how to use this data that's collected from students all over the world, I mean, literally worldwide, and how to incorporate that into their science lessons in their classrooms. And so that was pretty interesting for a while. And then I was also at the time teaching at UM. I was an adjunct assistant professor, mostly doing sabbatical replacement type teaching. Part of it was for the postdoc, some of it was just sabbatical replacements. And I was on the board of the Clark Fork Coalition at that time. And their staff scientists left, and I started thinking, well, that combines a lot of my interests, you know, of doing science in the Clark Fork River, in the public sphere. And so that's how I ended up in my job. I wouldn't say it was a direct line. It was in many ways fortuitous. And it took a while to figure out, but I think I finally landed at what I wanted to do.
I think just a personal note here, it was kind of amazing when I moved to Missoula 20 years ago and started teaching the environmental studies program, and found two of my college classmates, Chris Brick and Will McDowell, both working at the Clark Fork Coalition. And then I built a graduate class around ethical issues in ecological restoration with a focus on the Clark Fork Coalition. I was work in the Deer Lodge Valley, and Chris and I worked together for several years on that, and Will and I still work together on that. So it's one of those, yeah, when you say the non-direct lines, oftentimes end up with some of the richest results at the end of that. But it's really been delightful. Alex, you want to tell us a little bit about your journey here?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Chris and Joel. I love hearing these stories of, you know, where people have gone. I was like, my story is fairly short, because I, you know, started working for Weave like kind of right out of EVST. But I'll start with, you know, I decided to go to EVST in the first place because of the activist focus. When I was looking at grad schools, I knew I wanted to learn. I knew I wanted to, you know, sort of establish myself as, you know, some sort of scientist or expert in the environmental field. But there were too many schools that I looked at that were going to teach me all the terrible things that were happening to our environment and encourage me to continue studying all the terrible things that were happening in our environment. But there wasn't as much of a focus on what to do about it. And I really was attracted to EVST because these were people who were actually finding solutions and carrying them out even as students. So that's why I came to EVST, and I came from the East Coast. I grew up in New York City, so it was a real shift for me. My very first semester in 1997 at EVST, I was in Len Broberg's EVST 501 Scientific Approaches class, and I had to do an internship. So, you know, we got all the internships that were suggested by local organizations, and I looked through them, and it was grizzly bears, and it was wilderness, and it was, you know, and coming from New York City, I was like, this means nothing to me. I'm like, I don't know what project to choose because I don't know any of these. And at the very last minute, one came in from WEAVE, from Women's Voices for the Earth, and it was working on, you know, a project on the pollution from the Smurfit Stone pulp mill. And I was like, oh, pollution, I know pollution. I was like, grizzly bears, I don't know, but I know pollution. So that was the project I chose. Got to meet Bryony then. And throughout my EVSC career, I had done a psychology degree in undergrad. And I was really interested in what made people do environmental actions. So I kind of focused it on recycling. I was really interested in waste issues. And Bryony kept, you know, sort of hiring me to do, you know, like I did the project for her, for my class, and that was really interesting. And then I think I, you know, came back and spoke at some hearings and things, and I got sort of hired to work on a conference, and, you know, she kept hiring me for these little things. And I was like, well, this toxic stuff is great, you know, but I'm really more interested in kind of this other, you know, segment. And then I graduated in December of 2000, and was, you know, in Missoula. I went back home to New York just for Christmas break, and, you know, sort of thought like, okay, I think I can find, you know, a career here. I can find the kind of work I want to do. I'll say, but all my stuff is still in Missoula, you know. While I'm in New York, Brian, he gives me a call saying, I've got funding for 3 months. I got another project. You got to do this with me, you know. And I was like, yeah, I can live in Missoula for another 3 months. Like, that's great. I'll just, you know, delay returning to New York. That's fine, you know. And we worked on this absolutely fabulous project, which was the start of a national network called Coming Clean, which was bringing all these groups across the country working on toxics issues. And we all, the first project was getting people to do screenings of a Bill Moyers documentary. That was all about the chemical industry. So we did all this organizing, and then it was like, well, now we got to follow up with this, and we've got all these people interested in working together, and we got to keep working on it. And you know, Brian kept paying me, and I was like, I think the 3 months ended months ago, and I just kept coming in, and so I think officially, you know, I guess I was on staff in 2001, and I've been there ever since. And you know, I've continued with Weave in various different, you know, I mean, we was very small then. It was just, you know, a handful of us. We're a little bit bigger now, and have, you know, have moved on, and it's evolved over time. I remember my very first, you know, the first job I had with Weave, it was kind of, I did whatever, you know, Brian wanted me to do, basically, whatever needed getting done. And I was on the phone with a reporter from the Missoulian, because we had put out some press release on Smurfit Stone, and you know, and she was like, "Okay, and what's your title?" And of course, I never had been given an official title, you know, so I was like, "My title is project coordinator." You know, I just, you know, made it up on the spot, and that was my title for several years. But eventually, kind of really moved into the science part of Weave, and was able to, you know, work on a lot of the bringing in science kind of from the, you know, from the scientific literature to support the programs that we were doing, and was eventually made the director of science and research. But yeah, been there a long time through all kinds of things. But it's all Bryony's fault. So.
Alex, thank you. Yeah, I do want to acknowledge Bryony as the founder of Women's Voices for the Earth, which, as I understand it, this month is celebrating its 25th anniversary. So a real milestone for a fantastic organization in that area there. So congratulations, Bryony.
Well, I can in turn blame Bruce Jennings and Mary O'Brien for that, because it was Mary who turned me on to toxics, and Bruce who got the funding for us to do our first Women's Environmental Conference. And that's what led to Weave. So it's amazing how it just all keeps on going. So
it's wonderful to see these kind of intergenerational connections on these organizations, stuff like that. Vicki, do you want to follow up with the next question? Vicki, can you unmute? Try unmuting yourself first.
So the next question we had for all the panelists was, what do you feel was one of the most critical public interest environmental science problems that you've worked on in your career? How did you address it, and what's its current situation? Is it getting worse or better at this point? And it's up to you to pick whichever you would like. So why don't we start with Chris Brick this time?
Thanks, Vicki. Well, that's easy for me. I mean, I worked on a lot of different projects, but by far the one that brought me to the coalition, and the one that I worked on almost the entire time I was there, was the removal of Milltown Dam. And I'm not sure how much, I know a lot of you know the whole story, and so I don't want to repeat it, but it was, I got to the coalition in 2001, and there was not yet a proposed plan for what to do about the dam. There had been one that, for a number of different reasons, was mothballed, and they were trying to come up with, you know, what to do. Should we take the dam out? Should we leave it there? Should we, you know, just mitigate some of the problems? Should we just, you know, put in institutional controls, which essentially meant doing nothing? Or, you know, do we actually take the dam out? Initially, that was not even part of the conversation. And at the Clark Fork Coalition, my colleagues were involved in just a really, I think, incredibly effective campaign to make sure the public knew about Milltown Dam. And, we had billboards, we had bumper stickers, we had some pro bono work by a local advertising firm. And so we had some really good, I think, ways of engaging the public. And we did that on all fronts. I mean, I gave a bunch of talks about science. We had, billboards with, water skiers saying, ski Milltown, it's toxic. It certainly raised the profile in the community. And that was a good place to start because, a lot of people said, there's a dam upstream, really? We didn't know that. And we really didn't know that there was, or many people did not know that there were 6.6 million cubic yards of sediment contaminated with arsenic and copper that had come in from upstream, stacked up behind the dam. The dam was built in 1907. It survived the major flood of record in 1908, barely, but it survived. And that flood transported a lot of sediment from the Butte Anaconda areas to, roughly 120 miles downstream to Milltown Dam. And so, there was arsenic in groundwater. There was bull trout, which became a listed species, were blocked from migrating upstream to their spawning grounds. They could go downstream over the dam, but they couldn't go back upstream. So there was a loss of fish spawning. The dam actually didn't even pay for itself. It didn't generate enough electricity to cover its own costs. And so you think, well, that seems like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you take it out? And so this was sort of the question that I had when I first got to the coalition, because there were many people, including my thesis advisors and my dissertation advisor, who said, well, look, are you sure this isn't going to cause more problems than it would solve? In other words, if you take out a dam at the confluence of two major river systems, do you know for sure what the chemical reactions in the aquifer are going to be? Are we going to actually release more arsenic this way? Is it possible, first of all, there's the sediment issue of removing, all that sediment right at the confluence of two major rivers. But also geochemically, do you really think, the question that I had was, do we really think that the EPA, even after studying it for 20 years, do we really think that they've looked at everything that they need to look at? And it was a really interesting problem for me. And it's one of the reasons why I took the job at the coalition, because I thought that it was scientifically interesting, politically interesting, socially very interesting, and economically interesting. From the social side, the local community was split really 50-50 between whether or not it should stay or go. And it was interesting to talk to everybody about that. People had good reasons for wanting it to stay the way it was. And so ultimately, we all decided, no, this is in the best long-term interest, that the impacts can be mitigated during the project. If there are going to be impacts, we expect them to be relatively short-term. And so, after working there for only 7 years, the dam came out in 2008, and one half in 2008, the other half in 2009, and then came the work of removing all the sediments and restoring the floodplain. And that was a big deal too, because initially the first way they wanted to restore it, we thought, no, that's not the way that original floodplain looked. We had some really, really old railroad maps that showed a much different style of river than what they wanted to put back. And so there are questions about how to do the restoration. And ultimately I got to be part of a peer review group that the state put together to review the restoration plan. And we had some, I think, positive impact on that. It's one of the few Superfund sites that is now a state park. It's a beautiful natural area. And so, I stood up there once on the bluff. As many of you know, there's a bluff with signage that sort of describes the project. And I went up there with a visiting scientist, and he looked around, and I was sort of, talking about the project and what we did. And he goes, well, you can't lose them all, can you? So it was nice to have, I guess, a win. And it was also, I felt like I was really privileged to work on the project because I worked with so many good people during the project. I mean, once the decision was made, once everything sort of got rolling, I was on an advisory council that EPA put together for the project. We worked really well with the main contractor, and we didn't get everything we asked for, but we got a lot. And there's just good people at all levels. I mean, good people from the government agencies, good people in the community, all the other, nonprofit groups that worked on this. It was actually a huge team of people, and it was really a wonderful thing to be part of. And I feel very privileged that I was able to be part of that.
Thanks, Chris. That's great to start out with a happy ending story like that. And I just want to mention two other EVST alums, Peter Nielsen, who also was with the coalition for a while, but then with the Missoula Water Quality District, also worked very hard to get that dam out. And then Mike Custodia, who worked, another EVST alum, who worked with sort of the citizen action group for that area, and now is the park ranger for that state park. So we've got EVST's fingerprints all over that beautiful area.
And Tracy Stone Manning was at
Tracy Stone Manning
as well, when she was actually the push behind the campaign, and she coordinated that campaign. So yeah, even more. There's probably more that I'm not.
There's probably more than that.
Yeah.
So let's go on and have Alex indicate an important problem that she's worked on and give us an update on it.
Sure. Well, Women's Voices for the World works on toxics. So I think that the biggest challenge when we first started doing the work, we started working on particularly toxics in household products and started with cosmetics. The most critical thing really was convincing people that it was a problem, getting that awareness that it was a problem, because people were using these things every day. It's not something that kills you immediately, it's kind of this long, slow poisoning process that's very subtle, and it's hard to, it's hard to track. There wasn't a lot of science data at the time, to say like, we know this is harmful because of, these great studies. It was, kind of more of a general hunch, and, we sort of really believed that these things were problematic. But getting people to believe that was a problem was the big, the big issue. The second big issue, and this happened more when we started entering the world of toxic chemicals and cleaning products, was that you couldn't even find out what was in the product. So there were no laws, and there's one now, but there were no laws that required ingredient disclosure for cleaning products. So it was, I was tasked with the job. We realized we were going to move into kind of this area of cleaning products. And I was tasked like, okay, you have to write the report, go find out what's in all these products that are, that's toxic. And I looked and I was like, I almost got nothing. Like, it's really hard to find this stuff out, which really launched Weave on this kind of long journey of getting ingredient disclosure and really emphasizing how important that was. And we'd have, talking to these companies over years, and they're like, we couldn't possibly tell you what's in our products. Like, it would just, all our formulas would get ripped off. And, they were just saying, this is just not something we could possibly do. And then it turns out when you get thousands of people to call them and say, I want to know what's in your products because I'm worried about what kind of secrets you're keeping, things really do shift. So it is very nice to see that difference over time. Certainly with cleaning products, we got numerous companies to be voluntarily disclosing ingredients just because it looked bad that they were keeping these things secret. We were able to convince them of that. We passed a law in California in 2017, I think, we passed a bill that requires for any cleaning product in the state of California to disclose the ingredients in that product online, which of course affects the entire country because it's online for everybody. There are some products that aren't sold in California, but it's made a huge difference. So that's been very exciting to see that. And I'm actually in the process of writing a report now, going in and looking at like, what didn't we know? You know, what is being disclosed now that we didn't know? I mean, we sort of had some idea of what some of the chemicals were, and certainly with disinfectants, kind of the active ingredients, they had to tell you what those were, and we were real concerned about those. But now I'm going in and finding out, you know, all kinds of things that we had no idea they were using, and we're pretty sure that there were a bunch of things that came out before they actually had to just start disclosing, which just happened at the beginning of this year. So that was really a big problem. We've been working on ingredient disclosure, continuing that work for fragrance ingredients, and I can talk about some more of that later, and some, you know, some other categories of products as well. So we really sort of have been pushing like, okay, we need to know what's in, we know what these ingredients are, we need to know what people are being exposed to. And then you can start making these linkages between the products and what they're doing to our health. And of course, the science has gotten a lot better. I mean, it's been really, really great to see there are so many more researchers out there saying, like, let's look and see what's in people's blood, and let's look what's, you know, and there are chemicals that you're only going to get from these products that you can then link, you know, and they're actually asking people like, what are you using and how often are you using it? And we can make some of these connections. So that has been very, you know, gratifying to see that progress. There is still a tremendous amount of work to do. Certainly still in the convincing people that this is a problem. That, yeah, you can see Joel nodding his head because he knows. But it's I think it's come a long way, certainly in the years that I've been doing this. You know, a lot of people accept that there's a problem. There are a lot of more people concerned about it. But there's a lot of work yet to do to get these chemicals out.
I guess we've come a long way since so many ingredients were just under the GRAS list, the generally regarded as safe list, where you didn't even have to talk about them. So
that's right. Absolutely.
It seems to me like there's a lot of EVSTers have worked with Weave. Is there any others you want to mention? I remember Sydney Cook and some others.
That's true. Jamie McConnell is still on staff, and she's an EVST grad. Trying to think who else we've had. You know, I mean, endless interns for sure have done projects for us over the years. Am I missing anyone? I'm trying to think who else, Brian. I can't remember, but yeah.
Well, Weave has just been such a wonderful place for people to get started on these ideas, get some expertise, and then have gone on to work for Made Safe and things like that.
That's right. Oh, right. Cassie Randall. Yep. Right. Absolutely. Yep.
Well, that's a good segue, talking about generally regarded as safe.
Yeah.
Joel, ready to take up the discussion of that?
Sure.
But we did just pass marijuana, recreational marijuana here in Montana, so that's grass too.
That's right.
Yes. Well, I'm going to sort of talk about my biggest challenge has been, how do you shift the paradigm for the way we think about toxic chemicals from one about figuring out and arguing for eternity how bad it is to driving better, to driving safer alternatives. And a lot of that comes from, you know, Mary's work, Bruce's work, and in sort of my own experience. You know, my early years of my career, you know, I was trained as a health scientist. I wanted to understand the current system, so I studied risk assessment at Harvard. In the work I was doing with Greenpeace, I was working on phthalates, plasticizers that are in PVC toys, in medical devices, in cosmetic products, and spent a lot of time fighting bad. So I with Greenpeace, I was negotiating with the toy industry about getting phthalates out of toys, and I'd done the science. Nasty stuff, shouldn't be in kids' mouths. They shouldn't be ingesting it. It affects, you know, male reproductive development and a number of other, you know, problems. And here I am negotiating with the toy industry. We thought we were going to get these phthalates out of toys, and one day they come to the table and say, we're not going to. And I was like, I'm a 30-year-old idealist saying, what? These are kids. How could you think that way? And about the same time, I did a report for Healthcare Without Harm on phthalates and medical device, a broad coalition on healthcare on phthalates and medical devices that led to the FDA saying there's a problem, and got me in a lot of trouble at the university. Actually, the PVC industry came to UMass Lowell to try and shut me down, and luckily I had colleagues who and obviously mentors who said, your number one, and this is what I teach my students today, is your best friend is good science. And you have to have the best available science to defend yourself, because you're always going to be on the defense when you're in public health or in environmental advocacy. So your science is what you use. It's not going to save you, but it protects you. And so they came to the university and came to meet with our chancellor, and the chancellor said, well, we know you don't like Joel, but do you have any critiques of the science? And they didn't, so he sent them off. And it actually cost University of Massachusetts Lowell what is likely to be tens of thousands of dollars of development money, because the PVC industry put out in their newsletter, don't give money to UMass Lowell because they're against PVC. But that sort of experience led me to realize that, and I worked on this during my master's as well, is that this fight against bad is, we're always fighting an uphill battle. We're always fighting against interests that have a lot more money than us, a lot more resource to push back than us. And, really where we need to be focusing is a lot more on driving better alternatives. Because if there's better alternatives, the fight becomes less important, because there's other ways to solve that problem. So I spent much of the early 2000s working in this field of chemical alternatives assessment, developing out the methods, the approaches. We held the first international symposium on alternatives assessment in 2004. And then I worked with EPA to get funding for a National Academy of Sciences report on alternatives assessment. So the risk assessment paradigm was built in by a National Academy of Sciences book called the Red Book, which was published in 1983. And really, we needed that legitimacy of the Academy for this field of alternatives assessment. We got that in about 2014, and then held a second international symposium on alternatives assessment, and actually formed a professional society for the field about 3 years ago called the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment, or A4. And so really for me, it's been trying to drive that paradigm shift in, if we've got some evidence that's dangerous, we need to be starting to look at better options rather than fighting forever about how bad it is. And, I think we've made a lot of progress. If we look at, for example, the new European chemical strategy that was published about a month ago, there's a whole part about it on safe by design chemistry. And that was work that we did to try and push that idea that, you can't just stop bad chemicals. You need a supply of good chemicals, because why do companies keep using the bad stuff? Because it works really well, it's cheap, and it's not regulated. And if they don't have better options, they're not going to switch. So that's been a lot of my purpose, is really how do you drive the better chemistry and the evaluation so that we move from the problem space into the solution space. And it became really prescient to me about a year ago when I got a call from a medical device manufacturer who had done their own assessment. And 22 years after the work we did on phthalates in IV bags, that 70% of the IV bags sold in the United States are still PVC with diethylhexyl phthalate, which is the most dangerous of the phthalates. 70%. And you have to ask, after 22 years of advocacy to get it out, what's going on here? And part of the problem is there aren't better cost-effective, solutions, and we haven't dealt with the transition. So we've got a long way to go, but I think we've been shifting the mindset, and that's been my biggest thing, is how do we shift the system as a whole?
I've got, if you don't mind, I just have one quick funny story because of mentioning Alexandra's work on and Bryony's in Weave, and Joel, you mentioned Healthcare Without Harm. In 1997, I going to have a mastectomy for breast cancer. And I'm about to go into the operating room, and anesthesiologist comes in, and he's going to give me anesthesia. I said, is that PVC in the tube? And he said, yeah, because, and I said, why are you guys still using PVC? And he says, because there's no alternatives. And I launched into what I'd learned from Charlotte Brody and Healthcare Without Harm about PVC. And just then a nurse comes in and hears me arguing with him, and she gets mad at him and says, you are not supposed to be arguing with a patient who's just about to go into surgery. And he says, well, she started it.
I can imagine.
Oh, man. Hey,
Okay.
Vicki, before we move on, there's a question in the chat room, that chat box that might be, I think, maybe for Alex or for anybody, from one of our perhaps says, Ray Combs says, how is it possible that chemicals on, even going in women's bodies, had so little oversight or regulations for so long?
Oh, it's probably, and it's still true. There's still so little oversight and so little regulations. I mean, we've had some regulations which tend to be terribly weak. We've had some, some reforms over the years. I think it's really this assumption that people started using these chemicals in the the last half century or more, much more kind of in commerce, and there was just this assumption that everything was going to be fine, without having, and so nothing was put in place like, okay, you have to check these things before you actually start using them. And then once people continued to use them, it was like, well, no one died right away, so everything must be fine. Of course, there's a lot of unexplained disease out there that has gone up dramatically in the last half century, and we can't directly pin it to things, but we're really concerned that chemical exposure is having some impact on on that rise in diseases. But it's really hard to make those connections. So I think it's not starting out with great regulations, and not having that this person used this product and then they died the next day, and therefore it's too hard to make those connections when it's like, well, they used it over the course of 40 years and eventually they're getting cancer or whatever. It's harder to make those connections, but we are working on it. But I mean, the science is better too in terms of figuring out what is actually going into our bodies and how much is sticking around, because that's also been a problem with stuff that builds up over time. So
yeah, it's just kind of amazing that we're nearly 60 years after Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and still don't seem to be learning these basic issues.
No, I just finished reading Silent Spring with my undergrads, and I go back once a year to read it, and it's like, she got it. She wasn't right about everything, like mechanisms of cancer, but she pretty much predicted, when this National Group Environmental Working Group started talking about, chemicals that can cross the placenta and affect kids, that's new science. I was like, no, it isn't. Rachel Carson said it in 1962. So, but I think there is something about the solution space that's important. Is if you take most chemists or most chemical engineers, they've never had a class in toxicology. They're making chemicals that can affect millions of lives, but they have no clue about what they do. So there's a real need in the science too, and we've been doing a lot of that, is to try to bridge this gap between the health sciences, those of us who know how to study the problems, with those who design the solutions of the future, because ultimately it's this interdisciplinary science that's really going to drive us forward. And so there is that need, and that's part of the reason we have all these chemicals without anyone knowing. It's not like a chemist designed them to be poisonous. They designed them to be functional, and they just didn't know what makes them poisonous.
Can I just ask a follow-up question on that, Joel? I mean, I think that's been such a huge part of the work of John and Amy.
Yeah.
The Green Chemistry Institute, is that what they still call it?
Beyond Benign and
Beyond Benign.
Warner Babcock Institute, but the Warner Babcock Institute doesn't exist anymore, but John Warner and Amy Cannon, yeah.
Yeah. So do you think they've made much headway in getting toxicology taught two
They-
chemists?
Yeah, they're doing, so I'm on the board of Beyond Benign, which is Amy Cannon's group, which is focused on both K through 12 and university level green chemistry education. So they've done something like the president's climate change commitment, but for green chemistry. So there's now 46 universities that have committed to integrating green chemistry into their chemistry program. So about one in 8, yeah, I think it's 1 in 8 chemistry undergrads in the United States will have graduated from a school that has green chemistry taught in it. And the goal here is that to get that to be 1 in 4 in the next by 2025. So I think it is making progress. I think, you know, chemists, I remember you know, taking Tom Power's resource economics class, and remember the story they would tell about, you know, loggers in the redwoods, you know, switching to restoration and how good that made them feel to do something good rather than cutting down trees. And I think that's the same for chemists. When they realize that they can actually design chemistry that does good, they get very excited about it. So I've seen these young, you know, undergrad, grad green chemistries. I mean, I've hired some of them. They're amazing, you know, because they really do want to use science, and chemistry unfortunately gets a bad name. And, you know, so that getting new students into chemistry is a tough thing, but yeah, I think we're slowly making progress. Slow, it's very slow, but you know, chemists, I still know a lot of chemists who think that there's no problem. And, you know, I went into our chemistry lab about a year ago with my students in undergraduate teaching, and they were using methylene chloride for extractions, you know, which is a carcinogen and a neurotoxic. And it's like, what are you doing in a teaching lab? How can 18-year-olds use something like this safe? They can't. So we have a long way to go.
Wow, that's an incredible story.
No.
Dan, I was going to suggest our last 2 questions are so similar, I think they can be combined. Do you mind if I just combine them?
Go right ahead, Vicki. That sounds good because we've got just about a half hour left. So
Right. So I was going to combine those last 2 questions, and maybe we can start, we'll go in reverse order, Joel, then Alex, then back to Chris. And so combining those last 2 questions, it's essentially, well, what's the next big public interest environmental science problem that you want to work on, particularly given the current political context we find ourselves in?
I was trying to think about that. And for me, if you think about our current climate crisis, our plastics crisis, and our toxics crisis, it all comes back to the petrochemical industry. If we look at the history of the petrochemical industry, it evolved in about a 25-year period from the 1940s to the 1960s, and with significant investment of, you know, government funding, alignment of the value chain, you know, demand signals, supply, you know, procurement. And we have this unique moment in time where we're spending trillions of dollars in the economy, and this could be the time where we really get it right. And so we're trying to raise money right now to develop a roadmap to transition the petrochemical industry to renewable, sustainable feedstocks. You know, and you can't do one without the other because it's an integrated system. So if you get rid of fuels, you still need to put that petrochemical into plastic or into chemicals. So we really need to look at this as a whole. We can't get rid of oil. You know, we won't have chemistry if we got rid of oil. So we need to find new ways to make chemistry. So we have a long way to go, but I'm really excited about this challenge and think we are at a very unique moment where we may make major progress.
That's good news. Can we go on to Alex?
Yeah, sure. I think this was the last question particularly was the hardest one you had posed, and I always have a tough time trying to choose, you know, what's the worst problem. I often get asked, you know, what's the worst chemical or what's the worst product, and it's, you know, a lot of these things are comparing kind of apples and oranges. It's really, you know, hard to judge what is in fact worst. But I think what I've really realized a lot over the last several years is that, of course, all of our major problem issues, whether it's climate change or global contamination, toxics, plastics, racial injustice, gender injustice, these things are all fully interconnected and affecting one another all the time. So it's hard to choose what is, the worst, problem going forward, even the worst science problem. I think they're all super important and all intersecting with one another. I think that one of the best benefits that I've found of having been at EVST is getting to meet so many other super bright and creative folks all interested in working on other things. Because you can, I'm not, I think most, like, I've lived in Missoula for 16 years over the course of my life, and I love the Clark Fork river, but I'm like, I'm not working on the Clark Fork River, but thank God Chris Brick is working on the Clark Fork River, right? And I know all these people who are taking on these, like, we can have expertises in all these different things to all working towards the healthier planet. Because no one can work on all of it at the same time, even though these things are connected. But I think the real challenge moving forward is keeping that broader frame in mind, realizing these things are interconnected, and just uplifting where those things are, where those connections can be made. And so that, I think our academic system, across the country largely encourages people to be in their silos and have their expertises, but we really need to have that broader perspective, recognize that these things are intersecting and affecting one another, and working on one is actually working on all of them, kind of simultaneously. I think it's a hard perspective to keep in mind all the time, but it's, kind of a practice that you got to keep working on to realize that these things are interconnected. So I don't know if my answer is that they're all they're all the worst problem, but I do have have hope for the next political administration. I do agree it's going to be refreshing and nice to have science taken more seriously. But I think, even, as a scientist and as the science geek on staff forever, I love myself some good data, right? That's what I do, but you can't science your way, to the solution alone, and that's certainly something we've learned in the last 4 years, that there's a lot of persuasive techniques that have nothing to do with science that are unfortunately incredibly persuasive. But I think we really have to look at all of those different ways of engaging people, and science and having good science is certainly a backbone and a part of it, but it alone isn't going to get the job done either. You need good communication skills. You need to understand where people are coming from. You need to understand what they're dealing with at the same time. So it's really, encouraging scientists, especially, to have these broader views, considering all the issues that are interconnecting.
So better communication skills for scientists. We can all
Absolutely.
agree with that. How about Chris?
Yeah, for me, I think the issue that I'm most concerned with now and trying to move forward on is one that has been in the background in my career for a while, and that's climate change. I mean, from my early days in the GLOBE program through, we did some climate change work at the coalition. We put out a report called Low Flows Hot Trout to try to bring climate home to our local community in terms of what those impacts might mean for us locally. And then, I also worked on a watershed vulnerability assessment for, climate change. But now I'm a volunteer for Climate Smart Missoula, and I'll put in a plug for them because with a staff of about 2.5 people, they do amazing work. And so they work on everything from carbon neutrality. They helped sort of foster and push a carbon neutrality plan with local government. And so they're committed, Missoula County is now committed to be carbon neutral by 2050, if not earlier. Amy Sillenberg is the executive director. She's very involved in transportation issues in the community, solar issues in the community. One of the most exciting things I'm sort of hoping to participate in more or get more involved in is they have a footprint fund that they call, which is, it's for carbon offsets. And so a recent example is that there's this low-income housing, very low-income housing, people who are at risk and using emergency services on a regular basis for the county. And so, you know, Missoula County got a big, or the Housing Authority, Missoula Housing Authority got a big federal grant for it, but then construction costs went up. They couldn't afford some of the energy efficiencies that they were hoping to build in, particularly the heat pumps. But our local credit union, Clearwater Credit Union, had committed, just as a private institution, to offset some of their carbon. And so they, through this footprint fund, contributed the $20-some thousand that was needed to do something that otherwise would not have happened. And so Climate Smart is just sort of on the cusp of fostering this footprint fund for similar types of carbon offsets, you know, mainly for things that wouldn't be done otherwise. And it's primarily, and I guess what I like about it is that it's primarily for low income residences. And some of that's kind of on hold now because of COVID. It's not easy to just go into people's houses. But the idea is to use, you know, carbon offset funding to help low-income folks with projects that they otherwise couldn't do to help, you know, reduce their heating bill. So that's where I'm headed. I mean, from the national perspective, it's so hard. I mean, you know, you have one administration that joins the Paris Climate Agreement, another administration that pulls out of it. I'm old enough to have seen it, and I know a bunch of you are too, to have seen it seesaw back and forth so often on so many different environmental issues. And I think I've almost come to the conclusion that while you can, you know, advocate as you can on the national level, sometimes maybe the best thing to do is to do what you can locally. I mean, we're fortunate in Missoula to have a pretty progressive community. If you just show that things can work and set a good example for, you know, other places, that's seems to me that, you know, it's the old think globally, act locally. But in this case, I think it's at least something that I feel like I can personally grab hold onto and perhaps contribute to something better. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the next administration.
Hey, Chris, thank you for bringing up that footprint fund. I got the email today from Climate Smart saying that it was now ready, that people could start, you know, buying into it. I also want to mention that another EVST alum, Abby Huseth, works for Climate Smart. And a lot of times when people buy carbon offsets, it's for some theoretical tree planting thing down in the tropics that sometimes when they audit it, they find the planting never happened, or if it happened, they didn't take care of the trees and they all died. The nice thing about having a carbon offset program locally is you can go see for yourself that that money really did get spent on a carbon offsetting project. So that's great to have that here. I want to tell one quick story that came to mind when Joel was talking about finding safer alternatives to do something. When I first came to Montana, of course, the main focus was on what the pulp mill was doing to the river and what the old mining was doing to the river. But I also noticed that the river was very over-enriched and eutrophic and full of nuisance algae. And so I started trying to quantify that, which required that you had to extract chlorophyll from your algae samples to quantify how much was out there. And in those days, chlorophyll was extracted using acetone, which is very toxic. And then they started using methanol and DMSO, which are also very toxic. And I came across a paper in which a chemist said, you know, ethyl alcohol works just as well, maybe better for extracting chlorophyll. So I started using that and have used it now all these years, and it's now the standard method. We've gradually moved people over to using ethyl alcohol, which is much, much safer than any of those other chemicals.
Hey, Vicki, I want to give a shout out here. I think Bill Wissner has joined us here. And Bill, you were getting lots of accolades early on, especially when Chris Brick was telling her story, stuff like that. But you're one of our living legends and real heroes in the movement here. So it's wonderful to see you join the meeting here. We just have maybe 10, 15 minutes left here. And I wanted to see if anybody had any other particular questions. Or the other thing I thought might be really nice is what Neva's got her hand up too. But also, I would love to have our current students maybe introduce yourself just briefly and just tell the alums here why you're in the program or what you're interested in working on. We've got several here. Leah, maybe you get to start us off. You're the pride of Bakersfield and get us underway.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm always game to talk about Bakersfield. Yeah. So I was drawn to the program because I came from a place that I had seen change a lot. All of the farmland was being developed. The river was not running because that water was being redirected. And there is a population of almost 500,000 people that really didn't seem to have any awareness about these environmental issues or how much their quality of life would be improved by having a nice river. And there's literally like a handful of activists who are now in their 70s and need to pass the torch to a new generation of people who are going to help bring this issue to public awareness. And my background is in creative writing, creative nonfiction writing. So I'm here with Phil as my advisor and really trying to understand how I can learn and position myself to be an effective change maker, because I don't have a hard science background. And I feel very, very humbled to be among people who do, and realizing how much I don't know. So I hope that explains it. I hope that you guys can hear me because my internet is very picky tonight. But thank you guys so much. It's so wonderful to hear everybody speak.
Thanks, Leah. Seamus?
I would just add,
Chris, yeah.
that, if I could, just to Leah, that, you know, I wouldn't worry about the science thing. I mean, communication is quite often way more than half the battle. So being an effective communicator can make, you know, such a difference. And so, yeah, go for it.
And maybe I'll just say, but I'll put Seamus and Sarah on the spot here in a moment, but one of the things I love about EVST is that we have a cohort that includes writers, scientists, activists, farmers. Everybody comes together, and it's that mix that I think brings the dynamism, where each person, like Alex was saying, you may be working on one thing here, but you can trust that somebody else is working on something. And that mix in our program is just what's so vital about it. Seamus, you want to say a word about what you're up to?
Yeah. So I got some time to work after my undergrad, which was in earth science and English, and I really just wanted to work and to see what was out there. So I went back home to the Central Coast of California, and I got to work for 3 years on a dune system doing restoration with a public health angle, emissions from the sand from a off-highway vehicle, degradation. So it was a sort of a ridiculous combination of human impact and human reasons, natural reason, biodiversity and habitat reasoning, and all of it together came into this restoration project. And through that, I just got really excited about restoration as a positive way to undo degradation and restore certain areas. And then also I just really enjoyed the process, and I got so much out of it myself, saw so much coming out of it for the labor crews and the people I was working with, but then also saw how the ways we think about what we do has a really big impact on the result and the process. So I started seeing, the limitations, and, got to the point where my boss would say, you know, time to stop thinking, got to do a little bit. And then, you know, I just got to the point where I really needed to step away from the field work and get back to studying, and looked around, and I saw some programs that were very focused and very, you know, single project oriented, and then some that were more professional or too much like, you know, hey, what starting salary do you want out the door before they've even taught you anything. And so I just looked to this program as really interdisciplinary, and of course Dan's angle on the restoration and the ethics combined really brought a lot of what I've been thinking about together. So I've been enjoying that class, and I look forward to just continuing to see how much amazing restoration work has been done up here. And also I've been really inspired by a lot of the very upfront conversations about tribal involvement and rights, and I think that's direly needed in where I'm from, where it's several steps away from being integrated to the restoration. So I'm really excited to learn, soak it up here, and then see what I can bring home.
Great. Thanks, Seamus. Sarah, you want to bring us an East Coast perspective here?
Yeah, happy to. I'm from Connecticut. I went to school in Vermont. And after I finished college, I knew that I wanted to know more and that I wanted more experience in the academic setting. And I looked around at a lot of different programs and ended up at because of the fact that it is so grounded in community-based work and activism. I had a really good conversation with Neva about the work that alumni do, and that the work students are doing in this program actually has impact and works in the community. And that was something that I knew I wanted to do to make a difference. And then I'm interested in food and farming. So the fact that I'd have the opportunity to work on a farm while getting a master's was a really big pull. And getting to work with Neva and Caroline was of high interest to me to continue that work. So that's why I'm here.
And Sarah actually studied with one of our alums of the program too at St. Michael's College, Trevian Singer there.
Yep. Yeah, he spoke very highly of the program as well. So it kind of helped push me in UM's direction.
And Ray, I think Ray Combs is out there too. Ray's in our undergraduate program here. Ray, do you want to just say a word about your involvement?
Let's see. After a bunch of years in the military and federal law enforcement, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. And the native part of me has always known that I belong out here. Anytime I've visited the West, I just had that feeling. I've had classes under Dan, real light bulb moments in your class, Nature and Society. Neva, I've had a great class with her as well. Vicky Watson has the greatest lecture series I've ever attended. It opens so many doors and so many different avenues. Seamus, shout out to you for mentioning tribal involvement, because as natives, we're the original stewards of Mother Earth. We're the original environmentalists and ecologists, and our knowledge really needs to be called upon to help Mother Earth keep going. Excellent program, outstanding faculty. I'm having a lot of light bulb moments and translating what's in my heart kind of into the gray matter. So kudos all around.
Hey, thanks so much, Ray. And then I know we had a nice chat with Mary O'Brien early in the conversation. Didn't get a chance to hear from either Bruce or Bill. Do you guys want to add anything here? Bruce, how about your name came up early and often, Bruce. Why don't you say a word to folks? You got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, great. Well, this is a treat seeing lots of people from past times, but also the new generation of folks. And I just want to give a shout out that I think there's a lot that I ended up doing as a political hack in the world, sort of backed into from my academic background. And a lot of it points to a lot of the lessons I think are constant at EVST, but also amongst the speakers tonight, which is oftentimes the problems that seem, overwhelming, or that there's only seemingly dark sides to them, that in fact teams of people can really just kick ass. And working in the California legislature for so long, I have to tell you, over the years when people would say, well, this can't be done, and I'd say, well, you need to call this person Bryony up in Missoula, and she can tell you how you can do something like biomimicry, and it's not just a theory. Or people would say, well, you know, you're overstating the case for alternatives. And I'd say, well, here's the number for Joel Tickner, and you need to get him on the line. And in fact, I know over the years, there's lots of sharing. There's lots of people in this program and from our collective background who are very accomplished in not just falling into silos. And I have to say, one of the things that's distinctive about EVST, but also I think amongst the group of us, is that sort of perspective of, okay, I understand the problem that I'm in front of and it's sort of gaining my attention, but I'm not going to let that sort of obliterate all the other problems that are going on in society. And I have to say, my secret for success in the California legislature oftentimes was being able to draw on multiple people from multiple perspectives. It's partly what people are echoing here tonight, that in fact, if I was just marching into my committee on environmental whatever, that in fact, what I'd always try to steer the activists to do was to say, so look at all the public faces of representatives who are up in front of you, and now what you need to bring into the room are people who don't even look like you. So if it was the farm worker issue I was pressing on in terms of pesticide exposures, it would be bringing people out of the business community, because you could actually watch legislators defining how they could basically ignore the group of constituents if it was all solidly from one group. But in fact, and similarly, but you guys all know this, in fact, if you draw on other people and you have that as part of the public, not just public face, but in essence, sort of a democratic movement. And I guess that's my message for tonight, that in fact, I often find that there's a whole bunch of particularistic issues that I've done over the years. But in fact, if I can find the wedge to create space for democratic practice in that, whether it's increasing the number of people in green chemistry or protecting waters, or that in fact, if I can find the wedge to make that a more democratic process, I'm probably already ahead right there. So at any rate, kudos to all of you and your great work, and especially Bryony, who we all look up to. So thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Bill, you want to say a word? You're kind of a longtime friend of the Environmental Studies program, and your work has been so instrumental for so many things that have been done in the Missoula area.
Well, you know, how can an old professor not say something? The first thing I wanted to say is that I heard somebody mention the people over 70. Well, I have it on the best authority that Chris Brick is nowhere near there. So that's the good news. I think that my involvement with the EVST program stems back and from 1981 on when I took on students in their master's work. And the first thing I noticed was how well qualified they were and how academically qualified they were to participate on the projects that they worked on. And I think that's been a really big plus, a big part of the EVST master's program, especially, is they would let in very, very well qualified people. And then Dr. Watson would keep getting me involved in things. I don't know on how many committees I've sat on, but I've enjoyed that thoroughly because it gives you a wider perspective and you can make a small contribution in other ways too. So congratulations on the 50 years of EVST. And you know, I heard one time there was some kind of roast where they tried to cook a whole steer on a skewer and it didn't go very well. So I'm not so sure I'd come over for dinner, but I certainly have enjoyed being involved in a small way with EVST.
Thanks, Bill. Neva and Brian, do either of you want to add anything at this point?
I was just going to say, I think that was an MEIC rendezvous that tried to cook the whole cow that didn't work out well.
I don't have a lot to say at this point, Dan, other than thanks to our three speakers. I know, you know, Alex and I have worked together for years, and Joel and I have worked together in different ways, and looks like we're going to be working together again soon. Joel just convinced me to get on his board, so I'm excited about that. I'm going to transition off the Greenpeace board and onto Joel's board. So I'm looking forward to that. And thank you, everyone, for the work that you do in the world. It's amazing. And we will be sharing this talk with students via our website. So even though a lot of people couldn't join tonight because it was the end of the school year, a lot more people will actually get to see this, and we'll be directing people who especially have an interest in science. So thank you for your time.
Yeah. Let me follow that by again saying thanks to everybody here. And I also say one of the things I oftentimes say to prospective students or students who are entering there is that the relationships you form during your time in EVST are going to stick with you for the rest of your life. And those relationships produce so many other wonderful outcomes. And I think we can see that tonight, just the interwoven relationships, seeing Mary and Bruce and Bill and several other folks here. And then you passed on a new generation of folks like Joel and Bryony and Alex and Chris. And now we see another generation coming up here. And that interweaving of this, the kind of the passion and the concern and the real scholarship and citizen activism that goes behind that is, I think, one of the hallmarks of the EVST program, and makes me really proud to be part of it. So I'm going to just bring it to a close at that point here and say thank you, Alex, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Joel, in particular, for getting a really, really rich conversation underway this. Thank you to Bryony for organizing this, and thank you to Vicki bringing your typical passion and joy and energy to the co-facilitating here. And I wish everybody a good rest of your evening. And we're almost at Thanksgiving, which means for those of you who aren't at U of M, we only have about 10 more days in the semester here. So we've actually almost made it through a semester with COVID-19, which is, I think, quite an accomplishment itself here. So thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's fun.
Thank you. Hi, Mary. Hi, Bruce. My old friend. I wouldn't be here except for Bruce. Because Bruce knew, I have to interject. So Bruce was teaching in EVST. Mary might have been here then, and there was an opening for this job I eventually got. And Bill Chalupka was in Hawaii or something. And Bruce, I don't know, somehow Chalupka contacted you. I can't remember, but I'm here because of you two. Mary is a mentor of mine from way back in the 1980s. It's so good to see you. I'm sorry to take over the Zoom.
And of course, I'm here because I was at EVST because of Bruce. He sent me the job description of public interest science and environmental activism, and I thought, yep, I'm coming over. So,
and I never thought Mary would find time in her calendar to include this, but she came over, so it was great. It was part of the only skill set I have is getting people to the table who aren't supposed to be there.
Oh, I doubt it's the only one.
One of the best skills that you can have in a civil society.
I'll add one quick story then too, because I came out here on a sabbatical leave the summer of 2000, and the first 3 weeks I was here, there was this fantastic conference on sustainability. And I met Bryony at that. I met Janice Benyas doing biomimicry. I met Neva, because one of Neva's best friends from graduate school was one of my best friends from the Twin Cities. And so I met all these incredible people. And then I walked over to this really ugly looking science building with a big grill on the outside of it. And I walked up, and there was an office with a door that said Chris Brick on it. And so I walked in, and Chris had an office over there in what's now called the Clapp building. And so my first month here, I just got connected to everybody during that sabbatical year. And then I was really fortunate that eventually ended up to being able to join the environmental studies program too. But those interweaving relationships just keep coming around.
Yeah, and when you named this public interest science, it rang the bell that when I was going to go back to Oregon to do campaigning, I had done 2 years of a public interest science conference with Len Broberg, who was then a double major in biology and law. And he and I had put on 2 public interest science conferences through the law school. And then when I was going to head back to Oregon, I said, Lynn, you ought to take my place. So there's that story too. And of course, I did know Neva in Eugene when I was working with Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides. Yeah.
Well, I want to give one other shout out to Vicki too, because on Vicki's retirement a couple of years ago, she very generously started a public interest education science, environmental science, the PIES scholarship here. We have our first PIES scholar this year, Emma Kiefer, in the program here, but that legacy, and we just got another, Vicki, we just got another $5,000 gift into that fund. So that's going to continue to keep the public interest of science active in the program here. Really grateful for that.
I wish there was a way we could actually map all of these connections, because it would just be pretty damn amazing when you think about it.
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
I don't know, that kind of reminds me of the L word, which maybe is not going to, never mind. Lesbian community, there's this film